Lecture 1. May 12, 1959 Methods and Intentions. Let me begin with the fiction that you do not yet know anything about the critique of pure reason. This fiction is simultaneously legitimate and illegitimate. It is illegitimate since it is obvious that even today a work like Kant's epistemological magnum opus radiates such authority that everyone has heard something or other about it. However, in a deeper sense it is less of a fiction than it seems. We might begin by saying that whenever one aspect of a philosophy becomes public knowledge, it tends generally to obscure its true meaning rather than to elucidate it. The formulae to which philosophies are commonly reduced tend to reify the actual writings, to sum them up in a rigid fashion, and thus to make a genuine interaction with them all the harder. To make the point more specifically in relation to Kant, you have undoubtedly all heard that Kant's so-called Copernican revolution consisted in the idea that the elements of cognition that had previously been sought in the objects and things in themselves were now to be transferred to the subject, in other words to reason, the faculty of cognition. In such a crude formulation, this view of Kant is also false because, on the one hand, the subjective turn in philosophy is much older than Kant in the modern history of philosophy. It goes back to Descartes, and there is a sense in which David Hume, Kant's important English precursor, was more of a subjectivist than Kant. And on the other hand, this widely held belief is mistaken because the true interest of the critique of pure reason is concerned less with the subject, the turn to the subject, than with the objective nature of cognition. If I may make a start with a programmatic statement, a sort of motto, encapsulating what you are about to hear, I would say that the Kantian project can actually be characterized not as one that adopts subjectivism in order to do away with the objectivity of cognition, but as one that grounds objectivity in the subject as an objective reality. It stands in contrast to the previously dominant view which downgraded objectivity by emphasizing the subject and restricted it in a spirit of skepticism. This, we might say, is Kant's project in the Critique of Pure Reason, and he himself has said so in a not very well-known passage in the preface to the Critique of Pure Reason. I shall read it out to you at once because it may help to dispel a significant misunderstanding from the very outset. His inquiry, he says, has two sides, one of which is concerned with objects, while the other seeks to investigate the pure understanding itself, its possibility, and the cognitive faculties upon which it rests, and so deals with it in its subjective aspect. Point 2. He goes on to say that, important though this exposition is, it is not essential to his chief purpose, for the chief question is always this: what and how much can the understanding and reason know apart from all experience? Not, how is the faculty of thought itself possible? I believe, therefore, that if you accept right from the start that the interest of the Critique of Pure Reason lies in its intention to establish the objective nature of cognition, or to salvage it, if I may anticipate my future argument, this will afford you a better access to the work than if you simply surrender to the widespread idea of Kant's so-called subjectivism, for this remains true even though these two aspects of Kant's philosophy are in constant friction with one another. How this process of friction, how these two aspects, relate to one another in a series of configurations, and how this gives rise to a whole set of problems. To explore this will be the task I have set myself in this lecture course. But let me return to the fiction I started with. It is reasonable for me to assume that you have no preconceived notions about the Critique of Pure Reason because the traditional beliefs surrounding this work no longer survive. Once, some 40 years ago, a very important philosopher of the day remarked wittily that a philosopher was someone who knew what was said in the books he had not read. And this remark could probably be said to have applied to the Critique of Pure Reason. In other words, the aura surrounding this book was so extraordinary at the time that even people unfamiliar with the text seem to have had a feeling for what it contained, if you will pardon my use of this word. No other word will really do. The intellectual situation of our age is one in which no work belonging to the past really enjoys such authority anymore, and certainly not Kant's magnum opus. For the simple reason that the school that dominated the German universities until around 40 years ago has faded somewhat and has become something of a dead dog. 5. This was the Neo-Kantian school in its various guises. Mathematical in Marburg and arts-orientated in southwest Germany. In consequence, the Critique of Pure Reason is no longer able to derive any sort of traditional nourishment from that source either. I imagine, therefore, that you may well approach the Critique of Pure Reason with something of the feeling that it is like an old statue of the great Elector, 6 and idle standing on its plinth gathering dust. Something that the professors keep on discussing because, regrettably, they have been in the habit of doing so for the past 150 years, but not anything that need concern us overmuch today. What indeed are we supposed to do with it? You will probably have an idea that the Critique of Pure Reason is concerned on the one hand with particular questions of scientific theory, and that it is filled with discourses pertaining to the individual sciences. Discourses that for the most part have now been superseded. For example, you will all have heard something to the effect that the Kantian theory of the a priori nature of time and space has been undermined by relativity theory, or that the Kantian theory of causality as an a priori category has been refuted by quantum mechanics. On the other hand, however, the narrower, more specifically philosophical questions of the Critique of Pure Reason, that is to say, those not connected with the grounding of the sciences, may well have lost something of their exalted status in your eyes. For when you hear the concept of metaphysics to mention the other term that forms the subject of the Kantian critique, you will not generally be thinking of the same concepts as form the essence of metaphysics in Kant's eyes. That is to say, the concepts of God, freedom and immortality, or of the independence or the existence or non-existence of the soul. You have instead been brought up to find the true essence of metaphysics in such concepts as being, sin. Let me say right away that the so-called question of being does not represent an innovation when compared to the critique of pure reason, or a happy rediscovery. We could rather say that Kant has some very definite and unambiguous comments to make about the question of being in a very central chapter of the critique of pure reason, namely the chapter on the amphibole of concepts of reflection. And I may perhaps add that if you do not wish to capitulate to the current talk about being, and to succumb helplessly to the suggestive power of this so-called philosophy of being, it would be a very good thing for you to familiarize yourselves with these matters. It is not my wish to eliminate the problems involved here by proclaiming in a professorial manner that the critique of pure reason is a God-given work with the kind of authority enjoyed by, say, Plato for the last 2,000 years, or to assert that we feel paralyzed when confronted with these eternal values and unable to muster the necessary respect and the necessary interest. I would say that, on the contrary, such admonitions themselves smack of the impotence and hollowness implicit in any such concept of unchanging, eternal values. I should like instead to do something else. I cannot deny that I still believe that this work is one that deserves the very greatest respect. It does so for quite objective reasons, albeit for reasons that are very different from those to which it owed its position when it first appeared. What I should like is to make this book speak to us. I should like to show you what interest the matters that are discussed in it can still hold for us today. And I should like to rehearse the experiences that underlie this work as objective realities, as experiences forming an essential part of the history of philosophy. I attempted something of the sort in my memorial lecture on Hegel that some of you may have heard. 7th. So what I would like to do is to retranslate this philosophy from a codified, ossified system back into the kind of picture that results from a sustained X-ray examination. That is to say, I should like to urge you to conceive of this philosophy as a force field, as something in which the abstract concepts that come into conflict with one another and constantly modify one another really stand in for actual living forces. At the same time, and as a matter of course, if I have any success at all in achieving my aims, an essential task will be to enable you to read the very extensive text of the Critique of Pure Reason for yourselves. I hope you will learn how to distinguish between its essential and less essential aspects, a crucial matter when reading Kant. And I hope also to make things come alive by presenting them in terms of a number of models. It is not my intention to give you length paraphrases of the Critique of Pure Reason, or to supply you with commentaries on particular passages. All that has been done countless times, and those of you who would like such an approach can find more than enough examples of it in the secondary literature. Instead, I shall try to introduce you to the core philosophical problems through the discussion of particular questions that I regard as being of central importance. But I shall do this, as I have said, not through the exposition of Kant's ideas as a complete philosophy, but as a kind of transcript of the intellectual experiences that lie behind them. And the concept of experience, or what I wish to show you of it, is not one that can be explained abstractly in advance. I would ask you not to expect me to start with a definition of what I mean by it. Its meaning will become clear in the course of these lectures. You will be curious to learn about the actual source of the intimidating reputation of this work as the philosophical work par excellence. A point in time when a tradition has come to an end and when the authority of books is no longer taken for granted has the advantage that it is possible to put such questions. I should like to tell you that if I have spoken of the laws of authority of the Critique of Pure Reason, this is not just an invention of mine. There are in fact philosophical trends today that really do regard the whole of Kant's philosophy as nothing more than a cult object that has now been superseded thanks to advances in scientific knowledge, and that far from calling for philosophical labor it can at best hope for a certain antiquarian interest. An example is Hans Reichenbach, the logical positivist, who has defended this point of view with great courage, if not always with the requisite sensitivity. In his book The Rise of Scientific Philosophy and in a number of other writings, you may well wonder from where a book like this one of Kant's actually derives its great authority, particularly when you see that it says nothing about the major topics which might be thought to be of interest. To make this brutally clear to you, if you expect to find in the Critique of Pure Reason proofs for or against the existence of God or the immortality of the soul, or of freedom, you will be sorely disappointed. It is true that there is no lack of such proofs, above all in the great second part of the transcendental logic, namely the transcendental dialectic. However, these proofs suffer from the grave defect that Kant has always arranged them ambiguously because he has always advanced them in the form of antinomies. What this means is that he has demonstrated that both the truth of these concepts and that of their opposites can be proved. What we have here is a theory of cognition, but a theory of cognition in a double sense. The first meaning is that it attempts to lay the foundations of the sciences that in Kant's eyes are established and free from doubt, that is to say of mathematics and the natural sciences. The second meaning lies in his attempt to restrict the possibility of knowledge of those absolute concepts that you may be disposed to regard as the most important. You have to be clear about this. The Critique of Pure Reason does not polemicize against these concepts. For example, he does not deny the existence of God. And when Heine remarked in the History of Religion and Philosophy in Germany, that the upshot of the Critique of Pure Reason is that even the Lord of Lords is dying, wallowing unproven in his own blood, then the emphasis must be placed on the word unproven. 9. That is to say, what is limited is the possibility of proof. Judgments about these categories as such are not made in the book. What constitutes the enormous significance of the book and what really changed the whole intellectual climate in a way that reverberates down to the everyday life of our minds today is probably the fact that it denied that certain questions were rational and hence banished them from our horizons. Bernhard Grohausen, the historian of ideas, has attempted to show in his writings how God and the devil disappeared from the world in the course of the later 17th and early 18th centuries, not as part of a trend towards atheism, but because the questions about them ceased to be asked. 10. Now we might say that the achievement of the Critique of Pure Reason is that a whole series of these great metaphysical, fundamental concepts vanished from the horizon of what could be rationally decided. And in the same way, modern theology, as it has been developed by Karl Barth, following Soren Kierkegaard, has insisted with great feeling on placing the categories of theology in extreme opposition to knowledge and has argued that what applies to them is the paradoxical concept of faith. If this has been possible, it is because it is implicit in the Kantian situation, in the sense that the sharp distinction that Kant made between knowledge and those metaphysical categories is a fundamental premise for us today. Thus, if we are to speak of the Critique of Pure Reason, this critique must be regarded as neither a negative reply, nor indeed as a reply of any sort, to the fundamental questions of philosophy. It is rather a critique of those questions. It is a critique of the ability of reason to pose such questions, to do them justice. We may say perhaps that the enormous impact of the Critique of Pure Reason has its source in the circumstance that it was in effect the first work to give expression to the element of bourgeois resignation, to that refusal to make any significant statement on the crucial questions, and instead to set up house in the finite world and explore it in every direction. As Goethe phrased it, 11. This is a very different kind of outlook from the radical atheism of the philosophers of the Enlightenment such as Helvetius or Lametri or Halbach, who really did give negative answers and in whose thought reason was sufficiently confident to make statements about the absolute. It is precisely this that is restricted in Kant. The crucial feature of the Kantian work, and this will perhaps give you an insight into its inner nature, is that it is guided by the conviction that reason is denied the right to stray into the realm of the absolute, to stray into intelligible worlds. As he terms it, this explains why we can stand with both feet firmly planted on the ground, and it is thanks to this that we really know what it is that we can positively and definitely know. We might almost say, then, that what has been codified in the Critique of Pure Reason is a theodicy of bourgeois life which is conscious of its own practical activity while despairing of the fulfillment of its own utopia. The power of the Critique of Pure Reason resides not so much in its responses to the so-called metaphysical questions as in its highly heroic and stoical refusal to respond to these questions in the first place. What makes this possible for Kant is the self-reflexive nature of reason. By this I mean that, as a rational being, I am capable of reflecting on my own reason, and through this reflection, I am able to give myself an account of what it can and cannot achieve. This dual aspect of self-reflexivity is what enables Kant to claim that he has established the foundation of experience, in other words, the original leading concepts of our knowledge of nature, and on the other hand, it is what prevents us from going beyond this knowledge and entering into speculations about the absolute. Nevertheless, I should say at this point that the idea of the self-reflexivity of reason contains a difficulty and also a challenge that only emerged fully in post-Kantian philosophy and the philosophy of German idealism in the narrower sense. The difficulty is that we can inquire, how can reason criticize itself? Does not the fact that it criticizes itself mean that it is always caught up in a prejudice? That is to say, when reason judges the possibility of making absolute statements, does this not necessarily imply that it has already made statements about the absolute? And in fact, post-Kantian idealism did take up this quite simple idea and turn it against Kant. Perhaps the crucial distinction between Kant and his successors is that in Kant the reflexivity of reason is conceived in a quite straightforward way, much as with the English empiricists who similarly dissect the mechanisms of reason. It is true that at one point Kant does make fun of the concept of the physiology of reason that he found in Locke, and which ventured something of the sort. 13. But when we look more closely at what he has himself done in the Critique of Pure Reason, we discover that it is not all that far removed from such a physiology of reason, that is, from a dissection of reason, albeit in the case of Kant on the basis of principles. In contrast, his successors then faced up to the question of what it means for reason to criticize itself, and they were led by that question both to criticize Kant and to infer a series of answers that Kant himself was initially unwilling to provide with his critique. But I believe that it would be good for you to grasp the idea that, for all Kant's notorious reputation for difficulty, he was a relatively straightforward writer inasmuch as he believed without wasting too much time thinking about it. that reason is able to treat of the realm of reason, the realm of knowledge, just as effectively as any other field of knowledge. Connected with this, and this is a further prerequisite for understanding Kant that is absolutely indispensable if you wish to see what is involved in his philosophy. Connected with this is the fact that underlying Kant's philosophy lies a huge confidence in the mathematical natural sciences, and that his philosophy is absolutely full of the spirit of these sciences. If we wish to grasp the chief inspiration of the whole critique of pure reason, we might locate it in the idea that the attempts of metaphysics to arrive at absolute certainties by spinning them out of mere thought have all failed, and Hume was right to criticize them. But this does not mean that we should despair because, thanks to the persuasive force of the mathematical sciences, particularly mathematics itself and what today we would call theoretical physics, we possess an entire body of knowledge that actually does satisfy the criterion of absolute truth. Kant's achievement only becomes comprehensible on the assumption that science provides the absolute knowledge which merely abstract speculation had failed to deliver. I believe that to say this is enough to eliminate one of the difficulties that tend to crop up in the mind of the so-called naive reader who embarks upon the critique of pure reason for the first time. For Kant begins with the question, how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? This is one of the chief questions of the critique of pure reason. Without bothering with any long drawn-out preambles, I should like to say something about the significance of this question. But first I want to comment on the shock contained in the expression how are they possible. For when the speculative philosopher approaches this book, he expects a completely different question, namely, are synthetic a priori judgments, in other words, absolutely valid statements, possible? This question is not put in the Critique of Pure Reason. 15. You can see here plainly how difficult it is to understand a work simply by reading the text, without any prior assumptions. And if a lecture course like this one, and every lecture course on comparable topics, has any justification beyond the mere fact that it is advertised in the university lecture program, this justification must surely be sought in the realization that such works cannot simply be understood on their own. This is not meant in the ominous schoolmasterly sense that you need to know the historical context so as to be able to place them correctly. I am quite indifferent to such matters. But in order to grasp the fact that the problems under discussion are only comprehensible if you are familiar with certain force fields within which philosophies may be said to move. Kant's work is called the Critique of Pure Reason, and the emphasis here doubtless falls on the word critique. In essence, there is nothing new in this, since we might say that the entire history of philosophy is nothing but one vast nexus of criticism which has led consciousness to its ideas, its concepts, and ultimately to itself. In this sense, the Critique of Pure Reason is an encounter of philosophy with itself. Thus what I wish to say is that this strange formula, how are synthetic a priori judgments possible, does become meaningful, and at the same time it reveals something of the entire complexion, the inner workings of Kant's thought. It does so because what is truly substantial, the element that seems to constitute its unquestionable truth, manifests itself in the shape of the synthetic a priori judgments, and because it does not spin the truth abstractly from within itself, but proceeds from the truth, as Kant calls it, as if from a given, and sticks to knowledge that it holds to be true and absolute. Let me tell you right away what synthetic a priori judgments are. Forgive me if I speak at a rather basic level, but if I am to take seriously my own fiction that you know nothing of Kant, there is no other way forward. I must start by telling you what a judgment is. You all have a more or less vague idea of what is meant, but I am sure it is vague. In the old tradition of logic, judgments were defined as the union of subject, predicate, and copula, that is to say, an object which corresponds in grammatical terms to a subject has something different predicated of it. This is expressed in the form of as in A is B. This is a somewhat superficial characterization of a judgment because it presupposes that these components are discrete entities, which is not in fact the case. Moreover, the implied identity of A equals B is problematic because in general the concept beneath which a specific thing is subsumed is always broader than that thing, so that the judgment is both identical and non-identical. You encounter difficulties of all kinds here, with the consequence that a judgment is defined as a state of affairs of which it is meaningful to ask whether it is true or false. If such a state of affairs is expressed in words, it is customary to call it a proposition, Satz, but this distinction plays no significant role in Kant. In Kant we hear generally of judgments, even though it is propositions that are generally meant and not the interconnections between primitive, prelinguistic concepts. Judgments may be synthetic or analytic. This means that the concept in the predicate adds something to the concept in the subject, or, more precisely, the concept in the predicate is not contained in that of the subject. Where that is not the case, that is to say, if we have a judgment that adds something new and is what we may call an ampliative judgment, then we speak of synthetic judgments. And where that is not the case, where the predicate is simply a repetition of the subject, where it is implied in the definition of the subject, then we speak of analytic judgments. In that case the judgment is a mere analysis of its own subject. It merely makes explicit what is already contained in the subject. In other words, analytic judgments are really all tautologies. Kant combines these concepts with the additional concepts of a priori and a posteriori. It is self-evident that the analytic judgments are all a priori, that is to say, They are valid absolutely and unconditionally precisely because they are tautologous. Because they are actually not judgments at all, they cannot be refuted. They are simply repetitions of definitions that are presupposed. Synthetic judgments, on the other hand, can be either a priori or a posteriori. This means that if you make a statement about something, form a judgment about it, then this judgment may either arise from experience, Kant would say, or it can be necessary even though it is not already contained in the concept. Thus if you say, all men are mortal, that is a judgment of experience, since mortality is not implicit as such in the concept of men. However, when you say all bodies are extended, that is a synthetic a priori judgment. 16 It means that extension is not contained in the concept of the body, but notwithstanding that all bodies necessarily possess the quality of extension. You will now ask me, and this brings me back to the great elector and to the question of whether he has a wig or a pigtail. You may well object, for goodness sake. This is supposed to be the most important work in the history of philosophy, and now we have to endure an account of how synthetic a priori judgments are possible. We have to put up with listening to the assertion that judgments are possible which say something new, but which are valid for all time. On this point we have to say that the concept of truth in Kant, and this is profoundly bound up with bourgeois thought, is itself that of a timeless truth. To be absolute for Kant means as much as to be irrefutable by the passage of time, an absolutely secure possession, something that cannot be taken away from you, that you can keep safe in your own hands forever. The concept of a timeless truth, the concept that only that which is timeless can be genuinely true, whereas whatever can be refuted cannot really aspire to the concept of truth. That is one of the innermost driving forces of Kantian philosophy. And if, finally, the idea of immortality appears as one of the supreme ideas, that provides you with the key to the enormous emotional weight that this concept of an a priori status has in Kant. What he is concerned with in his work is a kind of tendering of accounts in which he seeks to crystallize those truths that I end up possessing with absolute certainty, without incurring any debts and without their being exposed to any claims through the passage of rhyme. Incidentally, what may seem to you to be rather Philistine analogies from the bourgeois world of commerce play a major role in Kant and in the critique of pure reason. And I may tell you that they are profoundly related to what is magnificent about Kant, to his particular kind of sobriety of self-possession, even when confronted by the most sublime and impressive objects. It is all quite inseparable from his bourgeois and Philistine cast of mind. In all probability you will do better to seek the core of Kantian metaphysics in this sobriety than at the point where he seems more directly metaphysical. Thus this interest in synthetic a priori judgments is connected with the fact that Kant really does require truth to be timeless. I should like to point out to you already at this stage that this is the site of one of the profoundest difficulties in Kant. On the one hand, he perceives, like no one before him, that time is a necessary condition of knowledge, and hence of every instance of allegedly timeless knowledge, and that it exists as a form of intuition. On the other hand, he perceived the passage of time as a kind of flaw, and something that truly authoritative knowledge ought to avoid. This explains why the question of whether and how synthetic a priori judgments are possible occupies such a key position in the Critique of Pure Reason. Lecture 2. May 14, 1959. The concept of the transcendental I should like to begin by correcting a misunderstanding or rather a crude blunder that I made in the heat of battle, so to speak, towards the end of the last lecture. I gave you a completely idiotic example of a synthetic a priori judgment. It is the kind of thing that sometimes happens when you try to compress too much into the final moments of the class. Needless to say, the statement all bodies are extended is an analytic judgment, not, as I stupidly said, synthetic, at least, inasmuch as we are speaking of the definition of bodies in geometry, or more precisely, stereometry. An instance of a synthetic judgment, and this is the classical example, that is always cited: all bodies are heavy. This is because the concept of weight is not already contained in three-dimensionality. But the need to clarify this misunderstanding gives me the opportunity to point to a problem that really does exist here, a very serious problem. As it happens, this is that it is very difficult to make a clear distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments on the basis of single examples. There is, for example, the question of whether propositions in mathematics are synthetic, as Kant claimed, or analytic, as Leibniz believed and as has since been reiterated by modern mathematicians. I may refer you to Henri Poincaré's well-known assertion that the whole of mathematics is nothing but a single tautology. The answer to this question depends largely on the context within which such claims are made. For example, I am improvising somewhat here, without being able to guarantee the scientific accuracy of my statements, but I am concerned more with the general argument than with what happens to be the case in the different sciences. If you take the definition of a body in chemistry, where weight is one of the basic elements, then the proposition that all bodies are heavy can be analytic, while it was synthetic in the realm of mathematics. These are highly complex questions, as is in general to question whether logical forms such as judgment, inference, and concept can be defined in isolation, or whether they can only be grasped in the context of the intellectual systems or structures in which they appear. These are questions that have emerged only in the course of modern developments in logic. Hence, in order to understand Kant, or indeed in order to understand any thinker, you need to make certain assumptions. This holds good for all intellectual activities that are to be found between heaven and earth. If you refuse to make any assumptions, if you attempt to understand a thing purely on its own terms, then you will understand nothing. I shall return to this point in a moment. In the case of Kant, you have to assume, and this is essential for an understanding of the critique of pure reason in general, that the whole of traditional logic is in place. There is a passage in the Critique of Pure Reason where he asserts in all innocence that, apart from a few improvements, logic has made no progress since Aristotle, and nor could it have done. 3. In consequence, in his conception of logic, he simply cleaves to the traditional Aristotelian logic, which makes a clear distinction between the different categories in ways familiar to us, namely in accordance with the practice of a linguistic analysis, and without taking any notice whatever of the interconnections between the categories of logic and the systems to which they refer. I shall also take this opportunity to draw a further point to your attention, one that has a bearing on the importance of the concept of reason for an understanding of the Critique of Pure Reason. You will come to hear of all sorts of concepts of reason in Kantian philosophy. There's the concept of reason in the mathematical natural sciences which I spoke about last time, and which I told you was appropriate for synthetic a priori judgments since it refers to highly generalized propositions that provide a foundation for judgments of experience. Then comes the concept of empirical reason that refers to material, factual judgments falling within our experience. After that we have the metaphysical judgments about which I shall have something to say today, and which provide the critical, or if you prefer, the negative object of the Critique of Pure Reason. And lastly, there are the judgments of practical philosophy that in a certain sense establish links between them all. Now, I believe, and this is something that is very easily overlooked in discussions of Kant, that you can only understand the interconnections between all these realms, which Kant himself sometimes brings together and sometimes sharply contrasts, if you realize that the distinctions between them presuppose an element of sameness, of identity, that enables them to be measured against one another. This unifying factor is reason itself. In other words, then, reason is the canon of propositions as they have been codified in the traditional, bivalent logic, that is to say, in a system of logic that is based preeminently on the principle of identity. In other words, the postulate that a concept should retain the same meaning, and the principle of contradiction, namely that where there are two contradictory judgments only one can be true. In Kant's view, every procedure that adheres to these principles is rationale, and the unifying factor, the factor that joins these different aspects of philosophy together and is tested out in its various fields, is the mode of reason as defined once and for all by the principles of formal logic, accepted uncritically though these may be. For their part, the distinctions arise from the application of this same reason to different objects. By distinctions I am referring here both to the distinctions operating within the Critique of Pure Reason and, on a larger scale, the distinctions obtaining between the various elements of the Kantian system of which theoretical reason forms only a part. That is to say, the distinctions in this entire system of thought, in the Critique of Reason and beyond, always arise from a reason that is thought of as identical in its application to different objects. It remains identical however it is applied. It may be applied to sensible matter, to the so-called pure intuitions, or it may be applied to the employment of reason beyond the realm of any conceivable experience and as a guide to action, where it is assumed that inasmuch as these actions are freely performed, they are not subject to any fixed obligation. Or finally, it may be applied to its use in formal logic, that is to say, in the quintessential realm of reason, the realm of formal rules without regard to any content whatever. Kant's concern is always that reason should not be criticized from the point of view of pure logic, that is to say, the task facing reason is not to discover whether it is internally coherent, for the validity of logic is everywhere taken for granted and reason itself is held to be identical with logical thinking. Instead, the meaning of Kantian reason is always that reason should reflect on its own possible relationship with objects of different kinds. And as I pointed out last time, it is always assumed, and this is a very bold assumption, that reason is capable of making an authoritative statement, a really compelling statement about its own relation to these objects. I wanted to make these points as footnotes to what was said previously. I should like now to return once more to the question of the enormous burden represented in Kantian philosophy by these so-called synthetic a priori judgments which I attempted to explain to you in some detail last time. Perhaps you will allow me to return at this point to my fiction, that you have come here without any knowledge of Kant. In addition, many of you will have come to a course of lectures on philosophy bringing with you some idea of thought without any preconceptions. That is reasonable enough since in your specialist subjects you will often find yourselves confronted by material or formal disciplines that are themselves based on a variety of assumptions. You will then be told that we are not competent to rest these assumptions, we are not competent to say anything definitive about the nature of time or space, or to decide what history is or the essence of humanity, or whatever it happens to be, but to test assumptions in general, that is said to be the task of philosophy. The consequence of this, of course, is that you will expect philosophy to be free of assumptions, because it is philosophy that makes possible the assumptions underlying every conceivable individual discipline of whatever sort. There are 2 points to be made here. First, to insist on this is to make excessive demands on philosophy, or rather, you are in effect coming to philosophy with a highly specific preconception, one that is indeed sanctioned in great measure by the history of Western metaphysics, but which turns out on closer inspection to be not quite as self-evident as might be imagined. A mode of thought that is absolutely free of assumptions would in reality be a kind of thought that is tied to nothing but pure thought itself. In other words, the philosophical problem par excellence, namely the problem of the relation of consciousness to its objects, of the subject to the object, would be prejudiced in a quite specific sense, namely in the idealist sense that everything that exists is the subject, that is, consciousness or spirit. Only if that were the case, only if spirit could itself generate all the preconditions of all knowledge without reference to anything alien to itself, would the postulate of a knowledge free of assumptions be satisfied. Even then it would be problematic, since the supreme presupposition, the assumption that might be thought of as the basis of every conceivable judgment, could not itself be inferred from anything prior. At this point even Fichte may be said to have come to terms with the fact that there are givens. Although Fichte's is the only philosophy to have made a serious attempt to implement this project of a philosophy without assumptions. In reality, what we see here in this entire clamor for a philosophy without preconceptions is something I have described, somewhat disrespectfully, as the mania for foundations, Fundierungswahn. Point for this is the belief that everything which exists must be derived from something else, something older or more primordial. It is a delusion built on the idealist assumption that every conceivable existent thing can be reduced to mind or, I almost said, to being, and being is itself a mediated mental concept. And I would say that one of the overdue revisions that philosophy today should demand from your pre-philosophical expectations of it is that you should liberate yourselves from this mania for foundations, and that you should not always feel the need to begin at the very beginning, for such a presumption implies the belief that there is nothing new under the sun, and that everything can be reduced to what has always existed. And the consequence of that would be to make the problems of history and of change in general absolutely insoluble. 5. So you should relinquish any expectation that Kantian philosophy should dispense with every assumption. And in general you should desist from making any such demands on philosophy at all. Instead you should seek to understand the role of so-called assumptions within the movement of a system of thought. I believe that if you do this you will make more progress than simply by posing mechanical questions such as, yes, but does this not assume that such and such is the case, and does this not presuppose something or other? A type of question that I would call infantile. For that is precisely what children do when they reply, yes, but to every explanation you give, and when they find that they cannot stop asking questions because they do not understand the matter in hand, but instead just keep on asking questions mechanically. That is to say, they just keep on asking for the sake of asking without ever responding to the resistance in the matter in hand, the resistance created by what it actually refers to. The second point to be made is that Kant's philosophy is no more devoid of assumptions than any other. And it is certain, and this is what actually motivates me in my entire approach to inducting you into the critique of reason, that if you were to attempt to understand his philosophy without any presuppositions, entirely on its own terms, without any knowledge of the status of the categories in his thought, you would fail utterly. Take for example, the central concept that his critique of reason is based on, the concept of the transcendental, of which he maintains in one of the decisive passages of the book at it, namely the synthetic unity of apperception, is the highest point to which he has attached his entire philosophy. 6. Even this concept is not derived by Kant from something else but is in a certain sense assumed in the course of his account. I shall read you an instance of this, one that is interesting because it concerns the spiritual core of Kant's philosophy, the inner essence of reason, which, however, manifests itself, curiously enough, as something simply given. He states in a note to the transcendental deduction of the pure concepts of understanding, which we shall have to examine in detail since Kant regarded it as the central section of the critique of pure reason, and that is no doubt exactly what it is, he states. But in the above proof there is one feature from which I could not abstract the feature, namely, that the manifold to be intuited must be given prior to the synthesis of understanding, and independently of it. How this takes place, remains here undetermined. 8. This is illuminating. It asserts that what comes to me from outside, the material of experience, in other words, the sense impressions, that these must be given to me and that I have no power over them. This is a relatively straightforward assertion, that the given is fortuitous by nature, and that no further explanation of sense data is possible, and it is also familiar ground to the whole of empiricist thought. However, Kant goes beyond this in a very remarkable paragraph at the end where he writes as follows, and I would ask you to pay particular attention since it shows how far Kantian thought is from claiming to be free from assumptions. This peculiarity of our understanding, that it can produce a prior unity of apperception solely by means of the categories, and only by so much and so many, is as little capable of further explanation as why we have JSTs and no other functions of judgment, or why space and time are the only forms of our possible intuition. 9. Thus you can see here that what stands opposed to the concept of the given, namely the organization of mind to which something is given, is something that Kant himself regards as a kind of given. And you could even read this very profound passage as one that Kant intended to be understood as pointing to what Hermann Cohen, who had a very sensitive ear for such matters, described as intelligible contingency. 10. That is to say, measured by any absolute standard, if we could or wished to transport ourselves outside the prison of our own mind, the organization of our mind, we might almost say the entire logic and the very mode of our relations, our inescapable relations to objects of whatever sort would itself be contingent ones, in other words, an ultimate given beyond which we cannot go. 11. I would just like to indicate here that it would be an extraordinarily fascinating task to track down all the so-called assumptions that Kant makes in the Critique of Pure Reason. The reason for its importance, and this is why I place such great stress on it, is that it would enable you to see something of fundamental significance for an understanding of Kant. This is the distinction between Kant and what is usually called idealism. This distinction is normally signaled in the usual trivial histories of philosophy by their habit, a by no means unhealthy one, of setting German idealism in the narrower sense, that is, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, and, if you like, Schopenhauer, in opposition to Kant. The reason for this, and I would ask you to take a firm grip on this idea, is that while Kant does situate the unity of existing reality and also the concept of being in the realm of consciousness, he simultaneously refuses to generate everything that exists from that realm of consciousness. The consciousness of what the modern expression calls ontological difference, that is to say, of the fact that a thing is not fully reducible to its concept, that object and subject are not to be collapsed into each other. This consciousness is powerfully developed in Kant, so much so that he would rather accept inconsistency, that he would rather allow all sorts of unexplained phenomena to enter his philosophy whenever he encounters something given, than, as sometimes appears to be the case, to reduce everything to the unity of reason, on its weightless merry journey, as Kafka phrases it. 12. This gives rise to not inconsiderable difficulties, for at the same time Kant's aim is to create a system. As early as the preface he remarks that pure reason cannot be conceived other than as a system, that is to say, as a coherent deductive unity. 13. The idea of such a system actually precludes the non-identical, that is, whatever does not fit into it. On the other hand, he always has the consciousness, and I should like to use the term that Horkheimer and I have been using increasingly in our discussions of these matters recently, the consciousness of a block. By this I mean the awareness that even though there is no unity other than the one I have already told you about, namely the unity that lies in the concept of reason itself, this is not the whole story, and we always come up against some outer limit. For we might even say that in a sense the vital nerve of Kant's philosophy as a whole lies in the conflict between these two aspects, the impulse towards system, unity, and reason, and, on the other hand, consciousness of the heterogeneous, the block, the limit. These two elements are in a state of constant friction, and he is always being brought up short by this block. The vehicle of this process is this concept of the given nature of transcendental conditions. I have already mentioned the difficulties of the transcendental, and last time, I told you about the concept of synthetic a priori judgments. Up to now, however, I have said nothing about the concept of the transcendental itself, even though it is the crucial concept of Kantian philosophy, which has been rightly called a transcendental philosophy. I am also fully aware, following my original fictional assumption of the formidable reputation of this term. You doubtless imagine that the transcendental is so sublime and remote as to rule out any discussion of it, much as at school the difficulties of integral calculus were thought to be frightfully off-putting and comprehensible only to the select few. That is an illusion, and I believe I can quickly dispel this fear of the concept of the transcendent. Now, this fear partly arises from the proximity of the word transcendent. Both concepts have their roots in medieval philosophy. I do not wish at present to enter into the complex question of the relations between them. We shall have ample opportunity for that later on. What I intend to do instead is simply to tell you what meaning the term transcendental has in the Critique of Pure Reason, and you will soon find, no doubt to your own surprise, that after what I have said already, even though it does not amount to all that much, the meaning of this so-called difficult concept will more or less just fall into your lap. I shall now read out to you Kant's definition of the concept of the transcendental. I entitle transcendental all knowledge which is occupied not so much with objects as with the mode of our knowledge of objects, and so far as this mode of knowledge is to be possible a priori. 15. In other words, then, to put it quite simply, transcendental means all those inquiries that relate to the possibility of synthetic a priori judgments. But not just to the possibility of synthetic judgments. Over and above that, transcendental in Kant means every investigation of basic concepts, or, let me put it more precisely, basic forms of a conceptual or intuitive kind, that enables our reason, according to the Kantian theory, to make such synthetic a priori judgments. Thus a transcendental inquiry is an inquiry of mind or consciousness from the standpoint of how far it is possible for this mind to posit valid synthetic a priori judgments, that is, judgments that are independent of experience. This transcendental inquiry is articulated in the positive part of the Critique of Pure Reason. It breaks down, on the one hand, into the transcendental aesthetic, that is, the doctrine of reforms of intuition that are necessary and constitutive givens which are not reducible to anything else and through which all our intuitions are filtered if they are to be our intuitions at all! In addition, There are the categories, that is, the basic concepts, for instance, the concept of causality or the concept of substance or the concept of reciprocity beneath which our understanding must necessarily subsume the given objects of intuition. The whole of the so-called positive part of the critique of pure reason, namely the transcendental aesthetic and the analytical section of the transcendental logic, is concerned to crystallize these elements. One further point should be made here, if you are to understand Kant's intentions properly. Unlike Aristotle, he is not content simply to liberate these basic concepts from their linguistic forms. Incidentally, as you may be aware, in Aristotle there is often no clear distinction between the intuitive forms and the conceptual ones. They are all mixed up together in his table of categories like apples and oranges. Moreover, Kant criticizes Aristotle for having assembled these basic forms of the mind rhapsodically, as Kant says, that is, haphazardly, without any canon or guiding principle, namely as necessary aspects of language. 16 For his part, while Kant must indeed accept the forms of intuition as something ultimately given because they are not conceptual in nature, he believes that the forms of thought have to be derived from the unity of thought, that is, from the unity of logical reason itself. This attempt to derive the forms from the original unity of our thought as an activity is what he has undertaken to do in the principal section of the Critique of Pure Reason, namely the so-called transcendental deduction of the pure concepts of understanding. Let me just make a brief comment on the relationship between transcendental and transcendent. Where words are related like this, where they are so obviously connected, there is generally more involved than pure historical chance. The connections are a matter of essentials. Transcendent means going beyond, and the concept of going beyond is capable of a variety of meanings. In fact, there are three meanings of significance here. You speak of logical transcendence, that is found when you measure a proposition not on its own terms, but as it were from outside. For example, a transcendent critique would be one where a cultural conservative criticizes Samuel Beckett from his culturally conservative point of view. That would be a case of logical transcendence. Secondly, there is a narrower, epistemological concept of transcendence that refers to a concept of being that is different from consciousness, beyond consciousness. Thus, for example, the difference between the thing in itself and the consciousness through which it becomes known. Lastly, there is the consciousness of metaphysical transcendence. That would be the kind of transcendence that is found if we go beyond the limits of the possibility of experience, as Kant would put it, and make judgments about absolute matters, such as God, freedom, immortality, the essence of being, or whatever else occurs to us. In the Kantian use of the term transcendental, you may well have to recollect this third meaning of transcendent in order to grasp the specific distinction between transcendent and transcendental. For both transcendental and this third meaning of transcendent belong together in their common opposition to the concept of experience. They are both concerned with whatever is independent of experience. But the concept of the transcendental conceives of whatever precedes experience, what makes experience possible, as an attribute of reason, an attribute of mind. This stands in contrast to metaphysical dogmatism, which, according to Kant, understands the transcendence of experience as something otherworldly in the sense of an absolute substance, something that even goes beyond the mind itself. A divine substance, in short. Thus the transcendental in Kant represents the transcendent nature of our minds in the sense that it supplies the conditions that make something like experience possible, and in that sense may be said to go beyond experience. But on the other hand, and this is one of the most remarkable difficulties of the Critique of Pure Reason, these conditions can only be held to be valid if they do in fact relate to experience. They do indeed transcend experience, but they possess no absolute, transcendent truth. They possess truth only in so far as they relate to experience, to possible experience, and in general are saturated with the objects of experience. Thus we might say that the concept of the transcendent is significantly restricted by its translation into the transcendental, and it is at the same time interiorized to a significant degree. This means that it ceases to be a dogmatically postulated principle standing beyond and opposed to human beings, and becomes instead a principle of mind itself, and an attribute of human consciousness as such. So much for the concept of the transcendental. But whenever you find yourself in difficulties with the concept, your best recourse is to reflect that transcendental means simply the quintessence of all inquiries that relate to the possibility of synthetic a priori judgments. If you do not wish to take this Kantian definition too literally, you can regard the transcendental as the realm through which experience becomes possible, although it does not itself arise from experience. As you can see from the first sentence of the main text of the Critique of Pure Reason, there can be no doubt that all our knowledge begins with experience. For how should our faculty of knowledge otherwise be awakened into action? But though all our knowledge begins with experience, it does not follow that it arises out of experience. 17 Thus in Kant all inquiries that are concerned with these propositions that are independent of experience, these synthetic a priori judgments, may be said to be transcendental at the same time. The concept refers to all inquiries that extend to the possible relation of mind to experience and hence to objects in general. Thus, then, is the concept of the transcendental. Thus the sphere of the transcendental is neither one of formal logic, because it is concerned with the possible knowledge of objects, nor is it a sphere concerned with the contents of knowledge, because it does not presuppose such contents, but only the possibility of possessing such contents. It is, then, a curious no man's land of knowledge positioned somewhere between psychology and logic, if I can put it in this somewhat provisional way. Is this curious intermediary realm, is the realm in which the critique of pure reason unfolds, and it is this that has earned it the title of a transcendental inquiry. It goes without saying that the existence of such a realm poses great difficulties. It remains to be seen whether such a realm exists in fact, whether there is a realm that is neither purely logical, because it has a material content, nor somehow empirical or psychological, because in that event it could not exist a priori. I just wish to point out to you that this is just one of the most difficult metacritical questions raised by the critique of pure reason. But here, too, I would counsel you not to be too hostile with your criticisms, but simply to allow for the fact that, by establishing this highly curious sphere of the transcendental, Kant has made it possible to open up something that seemed to him to harmonize with the ideal of knowledge, namely the sphere of a priori knowledge. The actual source of this interest in the a priori and what it involves is a subject we shall turn to in the next lecture. Lecture 3. May 26, 1959, The Concept of the Transcendental II. You will remember that last time we looked a little more closely at the concept of synthetic a priori judgments, the possibility of which forms the central theme of the critique of pure reason. What I now owe you is an explanation of the enormous importance ascribed to these synthetic a priori judgments, however they are to be understood in detail. We are talking here of judgments which are valid independently of experience or which hold good for all future experience. Your initial response to this will probably be to say that if we judge in this way, if we can secure knowledge in this manner, the fact that this knowledge is absolutely and necessarily valid is not so terribly important to us. We are generally interested at a fairly basic level to know whether these judgments suffice for us to orientate ourselves and, after that, whether they possess enough plausibility, power and penetration, or however you want to phrase it. Whether they are absolutely valid is not so terribly important to us. I believe that a certain lack of interest in philosophy is to be attributed to the fact that traditional philosophy makes truth claims that seem so excessive that we are not able to make them fit our own spiritual needs. I should like to say that the distrust of philosophy that we find here is or without its justification. In general, philosophy really does act as the idea of a timeless truth, valid for all future experience. We're the only one worthy of mankind, whereas it is not entirely appropriate for us, at least in the form stated. And I may add that its unhoned acceptance by the entire philosophical tradition is something that can no longer be tolerated by a critical philosophy. I then pointed out to you that at this crucial point Kant does not represent anything absolutely new, but he can be situated within a particular philosophical tradition. I may even say, without being unkind, that he is actually positioned within the philosophical mainstream, and that the general interest in the critique of pure reason can really only be explained if this connection between Kant and the tradition has been properly understood. According to this tradition, there is a world of truth that stands opposed in principle to the fleeting nature of the world of phenomena. This world of phenomena represents something of a delusion, and is therefore inferior when compared to that truth. This motif is regarded as being self-evidently true in the current of philosophy I have termed the mainstream. It begins with the Eleatics and passes via Plato and Aristotle through the great Aristotelian tradition of the Middle Ages, through Descartes and the rationalists, right down to Kant. The fact that the truth of such ideas of truth is by no means self-evident in reality can be seen when you encounter them for the first time in their crassest and at the same time most shameless form, namely in Plato's dialogue Meno. In the Meno, Plato provides the prelude to the theory of ideas, and with it the doctrine of the eternally immutable realm of truth, which is still the concern of Kant's critique of reason. What you find there is the statement, which is obviously felt to be self-evident, that human concerns, the basic moral principles for example, according to which we must act, the idea of what is good or what is just, that all these things must be known with the same degree of certitude as the propositions of geometry. Plato evidently remained quite unshocked by everything that had to be omitted and by the violence of the process of abstraction that is necessary before a concept of truth borrowed from mathematics can be applied to the concrete activities of human beings. One, I have already pointed to certain features that surface again in Kant's philosophy, and it has rightly been pointed out many times that the relationship between Kant and Plato is very profound, although in one crucial respect there is a decisive distinction to be drawn. This is in the approach to the absolute realm of ideas which plays a role in both philosophers. The distinction is, to put it in Kantian terms, that in Plato the ideas have a constitutive meaning, that is to say, they are the only essential and real things, while Kant allows them validity only as regulative principles, roughly, as unending tasks to which reality itself cannot simply be reduced. Thus in Kant, as I attempted to show you last time, you have a mathematical model very similar to Plato's, and you also have a method very similar to Plato's, one that modern epistemology would term a reductive method. This means that everything that can be regarded as ephemeral, transitory, deceptive, and illusory is left to one side, so that what remains is supposed to be indispensable, absolutely secure, something I can hold permanently in my hands. I have called this idea of truth the residual theory of truth, so as I have said, It is common to almost the entire philosophical tradition and includes Descartes and Leibniz among Kant's immediate predecessors. This theory asserts that truth is whatever remains once everything sensory, everything ephemeral and hence deceptive has been subtracted. To put it in economic terms, it is the profit that remains after deducting all the costs of production. For sensory experience cannot entirely be dispensed with. All these philosophers concede this after their own fashion, even old Plato. It is merely that in this tradition the epistemological value of experience is highly problematic. It must be regarded as the point of departure, but it may not be regarded as the actual source of knowledge. As we can see from the very first sentence of the Critique of Pure Reason, which is in complete agreement with the view of experience I have just outlined, there can be no doubt that all our knowledge begins with experience. For how should our faculty of knowledge otherwise be awakened into action? But though all our knowledge begins with experience, it does not follow that it arises out of experience. 3 Now, so as to extract from knowledge everything that does not spring from experience and that therefore does not change and perish with experience, this is what we may broadly, less technically, describe as the motivation that leads us to a preoccupation with synthetic a priori judgments, and that then becomes inextricably linked with the attempt to provide a grounding for the exact natural sciences by reflecting on their epistemological foundations. It would be important to reflect on how this ideal actually arose. It is a remarkable business. In your normal lives as knowing subjects, you probably do not give a damn about this idea of what Thucydides calls enduring gain. Point 4 However, when it comes to philosophy, you will probably all automatically accept this concept of truth. The fact is that we are saturated with all sorts of philosophical ideas of which we are unaware, and not the least task of philosophy is to make us conscious of ideas that we have automatically adopted without really thinking them through, and to examine them critically. So I would say that we need to consider in all seriousness, the greatest thinkers of the post-Kantian period, Hegel and Nietzsche, have both raised this question insistently, whether this equation of the truth with what is permanent, eternal and timeless, is actually a sufficient definition, or whether it does not predetermine the truth in line with a particular model, a model characterized by the handiness of its methods, reliable scientific methods for all eventualities. We might indeed argue that this handiness, this ease of application to all future eventualities, wherever possible, says nothing about the nature of truth in reality, even though the truth was the goal of the method. We should really ask ourselves how this equation of binding truth with timeless or eternal knowledge comes about. 5 You then realize that you are dealing with something primordially bourgeois. I have no wish to indulge in sociological discussions here, and to say that such ideas as timeless truths can be socially inferred, because such inferences always imply a particular concept of truth, and we would then land in a vicious circle we would be best advised to avoid. But since it is my task, or rather since I regard it as my task to make Kant speak to you, I should like to make you aware that this strange idea of the truth is something lasting and enduring somehow always appears where urban exchange societies have developed. That is to say, underlying this is an idea that nothing new should come into being, that the new is actually a source of insecurity, a threat, something worrying. There may even be something quite archaic underlying it, namely the fear of difference, the fear of anything that is nor cocooned in the web of our concepts and which therefore frightens us when we encounter it. There is, then, a kind of taboo on the new and unchanged that declares itself in the way in which the right to truth, the emphatic claim to be true, is given only to what is permanent, while whatever changes and is new is degraded in the first instance to the illusory, the transient, and condemned to inferior status. But over and above that, what is at stake here is the way in which this archaic need for security can be extended into ideas of property. What is so magnificent about Kant is that he still possesses something of the uninhibited frankness of a man who is not ashamed of his bourgeois attitudes, but who gives them expression and who thereby expresses something of their truth. In Kant you constantly encounter these homely comparisons. Like the famous one of the 300 imagined thalers and the 300 real ones. 6 You will constantly hear about firm or lasting ownership and similar figures of speech in reference to propositions we possess. The fundamental analysis of the metaphoric language of Kant's philosophy would undoubtedly be a fruitful undertaking, for the similes and metaphors in a text are not neutral, but reveal something of its deepest intentions, intentions that are mostly imposed on the author. However that may be, behind this whole enterprise stands the model of fixed possessions that is transferred to knowledge, and is supposed not to be transitory. But a further element lies behind it, one I regard as decisive. What is lurking somewhere in this idea that there should be nothing new is the exchange relationship. I believe that this is the profoundest thing that can be said about the bourgeois nature of this kind of philosophy. I am not using bourgeois here in a derogatory, aestheticizing sense, but simply phenomenologically, in order to define the specific character of this kind of philosophy and the history of mankind. Thus in this philosophy we find lurking the idea that the act of cognition is a kind of exchange in which equivalents, namely efforts and products, are exchanged so that debts are settled and the sums work out. There is a relationship of equivalence, such that in principle nothing can emerge without entering into it, that is, nothing that does not have to be paid for by whatever has first been posited. And in the process only this exchange relation of knowledge, that is, the effort, the exchange between the labor of thinking and the object which thought then appropriates, and the products of this process, namely the fact that the ideas work out, only this becomes the thing that endures, the lasting product. 7. I have already pointed to the ambiguity that lies in the concept of synthetic a priori judgments. The ambiguity is whether synthetic a priori judgments are valid independently of experience, which is how Kant generally formulates it, or whether it means that they are valid for every experience. This apparently trivial distinction conceals a crucial point, one you can learn from. One of the demands that philosophy makes on common sense, and which you cannot evade if you intend to take philosophy seriously, is that the crucial philosophical problems almost always lie concealed in such nuances. That, if I may be allowed to say so, also explains why linguistic problems, so-called questions of formulation, in other words, the effort to state matters as precisely as possible and to hit the nail on the head as cleanly as you can, have such an enormous importance throughout the whole field of philosophy. This is because the only way to do justice to nuances of meaning is to make the very greatest efforts to achieve precise linguistic expression. So if there is a gulf between independently of experience and for every future experience, this must conceal a problem, a very serious problem, and, as I believe, a key problem for Kantian philosophy and for epistemology in general. I would like to explain this problem to you in a few words so as to provide you with the model for the theoretical method that underpins THTS lecture course as a whole. It is that a system like Kant's, that to all intents and appearances seems to be a coherent totality, held together in a deductive unity, is in reality a force field, one that can only be properly understood if you understand the forces that come together in a kind of productive friction, and if you are able to bring such a text to life. The assumption of the inferiority of experience about which I have been speaking is one that permeates the whole of philosophy, and is ultimately connected with the separation of manual and mental labor, and the making absolute of mind in fixed logical forms. This assumption demands that synthetic a priori judgments should be free of experience of every kind. What this conflicts with, however, is the fact that these synthetic a priori judgments are simply full of elements of every conceivable kind that are drawn from experience and about which I could know nothing in the absence of experience. I have already read out to you for a second time the key sentence from the celebrated introduction to the Critique of Pure Reason, and this idea is expressed there in the statement that while it is true that all our knowledge begins with experience, it does not rise from experience. But I should like to say that this crass dichotomy has something dogmatic about it. If something begins at a certain point, it cannot be wholly unconnected with its origins. It is quite true, and this really does lead us into a discussion of Kant's core concerns, that time and space or the forms of our thought cannot simply be inferred from experience, and that logical propositions are not simply facts of experience comparable to the observations we make of the physical world. But on the other hand, if there were no such thing as experience, if we did not receive from experience the elements that are formulated in these propositions, even these allegedly experience-free propositions would not be possible. And this is the source of the variant reading, for all future experience. I can easily produce any number of propositions. My old teacher Cornelius always enjoyed doing this 8 that could be classified as synthetic a priori judgments in the sense understood in the Critique of Pure Reason, but which notwithstanding this cannot be said to be independent of experience. For example, orange comes between red and yellow on the color scale 9. As long as you are familiar with red and yellow, this statement has an absolutely compelling truth. It remains valid for all future experience. This means that it is a synthetic a priori judgment according to this definition of the term. However, it unquestionably arises from experience and not from pure thought, for pure thought alone can tell you nothing whatever about colors. Colors are sense data, and if you have not seen red and yellow, then you do not know what a color scale is, and hence do not know what orange is either. I should say here for purposes of clarification that you must always distinguish the source of the so-called deictic from other definitions, that is to say, a reference to some sensory phenomena or other that cannot be defined. You cannot define red. At most you can say what is playing upon your retina, and even then USDI. LL will not know what red is. A further source of knowledge is defined by means of concepts, as this has been understood in traditional logic. Now there is a whole series of deictic definitions that are a priori in nature, but which necessarily refer to experience. I should like to say, however, that this all sounds splendid and it helps you to circumvent one of the difficulties with the Critique of Pure Reason, namely, that you underestimate experience and therefore exclude from the realm of synthetic a priori judgments an infinite number of propositions that undoubtedly possess an a priori character as Kant understood it. However, in so doing, and here you come to something which is highly characteristic of Kant's philosophy, you introduce as a source of knowledge the very thing that has been excluded from it in the course of the Critique of Reason, namely, experience itself. There might nevertheless be asked, well, if such a synthetic a priori judgment arises from experience, why should experience be deemed inferior when compared to absolute truth, as has been repeatedly claimed by rationalist and idealist philosophers ever since Plato? If I include Kant in this tradition, I can only do so with a significant reservation, and this brings me to what is specifically new about Kant. This specifically new aspect lies not so much in the thesis he advances as in the general direction of his gaze. What is new in Kant is not the doctrine of the synthetic a priori judgment as the truly authoritative shape of truth. Something similar can be found, for instance, in Descartes' innate ideas, which can be regarded as the ancestors of all these Kantian ideas. Or you can find it in Leibniz's Vérité de raison, which we might then describe as the grandfather of the Kantian concept. What is particular to Kant, and I believe that this will convey a much more specific understanding of Kant's point of departure, is that these truths of reason are nor simply inferred by him, they are not simply taught, nor are they asserted gesetzt, as Fichte would have called it, where instead they are reflected upon. This means that if they are to be proved, if they are to be valid, they must be subjected to a kind of process of inspection. You can say therefore, and I believe this is important for an understanding of the critique of pure reason as a whole, that the theme of the critique of pure reason is not just the speculative production or generation of these synthetic a priori judgments, but rather the scrutiny of their validity. In the critique of pure reason, Kant's concern is to test the validity of judgments whose validity is assumed. This is closely linked to something else I have mentioned. Kant takes the existence of the mathematical natural sciences for granted. The emotional force of the critique of pure reason lies in the fact that he is convinced of the overwhelming power and dignity of these theories. What he then does is to conduct a huge audit in order to establish why these sciences whose existence is taken for granted can be said to be truly valid, without making any attempt to generate them from pure thought or speculative philosophy. This is what distinguishes Kant's philosophy both from the philosophy that preceded his own and from that of his immediate successors, who appealed to his authority. What is at issue here is not so much that these absolute truths should emerge from the philosophy, as that a kind of process of reflection, of testing, should take place. The effect of this process is to consolidate the validity of this entire structure whose truth is already assumed on the basis of the positive validity of the sciences. And this is actually what Kant means by critique. The path then taken by his successors is one in which they said, by practicing critique in this fashion, I must always also say that by virtue of the critical reasoning, I actually produce and generate and create what the criticized reason is able to express as its particular finite and limited truth. This element of reflecting on knowledge in order to test its validity is the feature that Kant shares with empiricism, above all with Hume. You will all have heard already at some point that Kant claimed that Hume had aroused him from his dogmatic slumber. 10. You will all be familiar with the general statement that is to be found in textbooks and lectures to the effect that Kant's philosophy represents a union of the Leibniz-Wolff school from which he came and Hume's empiricism. And if you wish to provide a rough and ready summary of the force field I have been speaking about, this rather unsophisticated formula would do well enough. But I believe that for a more sophisticated, less elementary view, it is necessary to achieve greater clarity about the relative importance of these elements in Kant's philosophy. On this point, my view would be that the Vérités de raison, the synthetic a priori judgments, in short, the incontrovertibly true and valid modes of knowledge that far surpass mere logic, may be described as the roast, the Leibnizian or Cartesian roast, while Hume and English skepticism provide the dialectical salt. That is to say, this skepticism is the method through which the critical scrutiny is undertaken, but the empirical strength does not play so very great a role in the plan of the entire system. The fact is that skepticism already finds expression in the demonstrable existence of the sciences, since it is only their validity which is to be reviewed. Kant's philosophy makes use of doubt of critical examination, so as to ensure that what it perceives as incontrovertible truth should shine forth in all its glory because it has withstood even that skeptical inspection. What you never find in Kant is what might be termed metaphysical skepticism, that is, a skepticism that is directed, for instance, at the absolute character of these truths. Thanks to this we may say that Kant's distance from Hume, which occasionally seems to be minimal, a matter of fine distinctions, is in reality a matter of his philosophy as a whole. This is something frequently encountered in philosophy, where the identical theses may have completely different meanings within the general parameters, the general emotional thrust of a given philosophy. The solution Kant provides, to sum it up rather crudely, is that the truths he is concerned with and whose validity he demonstrates with the aid of the skeptical analysis of consciousness that he has borrowed, are indeed supposed to be valid for all time, but they are not timeless as such. They are not free-floating entities, but are timeless only with regard to experience. They are the supreme principles that actually make experience possible, rather than truths detached from experience. His method, then, is that of analysis of the faculty of cognition as a whole in so far as it makes experience possible. Or, as Kant puts it in his own language, he is interested in the elements or features of the faculty of cognition that constitute experience or knowledge in general. It will not have escaped you that there is a very serious problem here, one that I am not able to resolve today, but which I should like to bring to your attention, so that you should not think that we are just skating over the difficulties. The fact is that I had said to you, on the one hand, that Kant is concerned with the constitution of timeless, absolutely valid modes of knowledge. Now you suddenly hear from me that these modes of knowledge should only exist if they constitute something like experience. With this we arrive at the point where the skepticism to which he has subjected his truths of reason has left its scars. So, on the one hand, he wishes to salvage the timeless, absolutely valid experience of independent truth. 11. And we shall have to talk at length about Kant's desire to salvage what is threatened. 12. The critique of pure reason is in general a supreme attempt to salvage ontology on a subjectivist basis, if I may speak so grandiloquently. For on the other hand, despite this rescue attempt, his analysis does extend ultimately into the realm of concrete consciousness and therefore also assumes an element of experience. And he and that uphold these absolute propositions as something substantive independently of experience because they can never be free of some substantive elements or other. And this is how he arrives at the highly curious theory that they constitute experience. I should like to tell you now what we shall be looking at later on. This is one of the genuine difficulties of the critique of pure reason, and it is my view that you will best deal with these difficulties if you refrain from saying, look, he has made a mistake. He has got it wrong. Old Kant has really made a fool of himself here instead. You would do better to try and understand that the difficulties you discern in the critique of pure reason have their roots in this constant friction created by opposing strands of thought that then inflict all kinds of damage on each other. The entire critique of pure reason is acted out in a peculiar no man's land. On the one hand, it cannot be a purely formal logic, since in that case the propositions that are crucial to it could not be synthetic propositions. On the other hand, however, they may not have any content, since in that event they would be empirical propositions and would once again not be synthetic a priori propositions. Through this peculiar difficulty you enter into the true realm in which Kantian ideas have their being. This is the realm that could properly be called the transcendental realm, in a less pedantic sense than when I expounded it to you last time. It could be thought of here as a speculative realm, or the need somehow or other to reconcile two otherwise irreconcilable concepts leads to intellectual constructs that cannot refer to any immediately given, positive realities, but which are motivated by the forward march of the analysis. Only if you make allowances for the peculiar structure of the philosophy of Kant and even more of his successors, will you be in a position to understand the entire thrust of this philosophical idealism. What is generally referred to as Kant's Copernican revolution is essentially concerned with the fact that those absolute truths are independent of experience, but form the object of criticism, so that criticism drives a trench through the middle of their realm, accepting some propositions and rejecting others. Kant's Copernican revolution is nothing other than the fact that this entire realm is no longer simply visited so that these things can be discussed and judged directly, but instead they are involved in the process of reflection. When I said to you earlier that the novel aspect of the critique of pure reason was the reflection of reason on itself, that reflexivity is what lies at the heart of the Copernican revolution. The truths that are the object of concern in the critique of pure reason are not supposed to be externally demonstrated and presented or asserted anymore as freestanding things as in Plato's theory. Instead, they are to prove their worth by the fact that reason examines itself and then discovers in itself the constitutive elements thanks to which something like a universally valid and objective knowledge can be made possible. This is the revolution which Kant regarded as his own par 13 titular achievement. It is important that you should understand me rightly here. It is not simply the turn to the subject that is crucial here. That turn had been accomplished long before in skeptical and empirical philosophy, but also in the philosophy of the great rationalists. The specifically novel element here is that objectivity itself, that is, the validity of knowledge as such, is created by passing through subjectivity, by reflecting on the mechanisms of knowledge, its possibilities and its limits. In this system the subject becomes, if not the creator, then at least the guarantor of objectivity. This, in short, is the decisive thesis of the critique of pure reason, and if you use this intention as a guide it may help you over the obstacles presented by the work. Lecture 4. June 2, 1959 Metaphysics I. Given the ambitious nature of a work like the Critique of Pure Reason, many of you will perhaps be